both with the portable scales.
Yeah, I think it really started with my experiences growing up. We always went camping, particularly in the mountains in West Virginia and Kentucky for vacation. And that got me connected with environmental issues. And I had kind of always been active in environmental issues. And then through high school, I went through a vocational radio broadcasting program. And in college, I majored in broadcasting. And I saw documentary as a way to basically link those two. My interest in environmental issues and my skills in broadcasting. And that's eventually what led me to Appalshop and what led me to start documentary filmmaking as well. Appalshop has had a huge influence on my life and career. You know, I actually started working for WMMT and worked there for about a decade, which helped me really, as someone who didn't grow up in the coal fields, helped me understand the nuances and the specific culture and the importance of place in the coal fields. And I think in terms of documentary filmmaking, it particularly uh, changed my thinking from just looking at environmental impacts on, say, water or wildlife to really thinking about environmental impacts on people and communities. The catchphrase I often heard from Appalshop's founders and from a lot of activists I would work with was, "What you do to the land, you do to the people." And I feel like understanding those human impacts and how it impacts issues like labor are really sort of created this foundation that drove inspired all of my work, but in particularly inspired Coal Bucket Outlaw, where we are really focusing more on the labor issues. I mean, they're connected to environmental issues, but the documentary is much more about labor than the environment. But to me, that's working at Appalshop helped me understand those connections and this idea of community and how media can create conversations within a community to start to address issues. Well, I guess we'll probably have to go all the way back to the late '90s, mid to late '90s. You know, I was a relatively young man then, not anymore. And for most young men around Letcher County and in the coal fields, coal hauling was a major source of employment. So a lot of my friends and peers were truckers. And so I would end up being at parties with them or out and hearing stories about the working conditions and about the need to haul illegal overweight loads in order to make a living. At the same time, I was doing a lot of work with environmental organizations, doing work opposing mountaintop removal, coal mining, and hearing from that side about all the damage that's happening and how the coal truckers are part of the damage. So I really have been thinking about that and realizing that there are two separate conversations going on in the same community that probably need to be brought together. And so this it took me several years to start to bring it together and to make it to fruition. And so that was kind of the genesis. I don't think there was a single moment, but it was a series of stories that I was hearing, and stories from two very different perspectives, but often very dramatic stories. You know, stories of dangerous work conditions and stories of danger and death caused from those conditions. That started me thinking, okay, how do we bring those stories together, and how do we use those stories to illuminate the larger system that's producing coal and electricity in the United States during that time around the year 2000? Well, it took a long time, to be honest. But building trust takes time, and I probably started having conversations with coal truck drivers about 2 years before I started production. And most folks didn't want anything to do with the camera. They'd be glad to hang out with me and tell me stories off the record, you know, shoot the shit. But in terms of being captured on camera, they drew the line there. And I respected that and just kept talking to different people, and eventually found Herbie Adams, who actually was a neighbor of mine, living on Little Cowan at the time in Letcher County. And he knew of me, knew where I lived, and was, I think, a little older and more settled, perhaps in his ways, a little more confident. And really, he kind of opened the door And through him, as well as through Roy Crawford, the safety advocate and an engineer who's featured in the film, I was able to then meet other truckers and kind of expand those circles. But it took a long time. It took a lot of conversations. I remember with Herbie, I rode with him 3 or 4 times without before we shot. I would just talk to him, or sometimes take pictures and give him prints of those pictures. And so it took a while to kind of build some reciprocal relationships that then built that trust and allowed me the access that I needed to make the film I wanted to make for Call Bucket Outlaw.
I know, I was mentioning Roy Crawford. There's a series of stories in this film, and they're all very personal. They're all very personal to everyone who's talking about them. Whether it's me and my family, with Kim Greer saying, me and my family, we have to rely on this, and we have to do what we have to do to make our money. Or to Roy Crawford, who had a very personal experience with the death of his son. Are there any particular stories in this piece that stand out to you, or that really deeply affected you, that kind of you hold on to?
Yeah, I guess I mean all of those that you mentioned, I hold on to, and I still, Herbie Adams has since passed away. Unfortunately, he died in a car accident better part of 10 years ago. I'm still in touch with some of his family, and Kim Greer, I'm still in touch with as well. They're actually living in southern Kentucky now and are out of the coal hauling business completely. And Roy, I stay in touch with intermittently. I know he's still around Letcher County. Is retired, but working in the arts, volunteering with arts groups. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick out one story. If I had to pick out one moment, probably a dramatic moment that it's hinted at on camera, doesn't appear. It's when um, Herbie Adams convinced me to trade places with him when I was filming. We were driving on US 23 down Indian Creek. This is definitely illegal, but I think we're past the statutes of limitations here. So, but yeah, he was just like, "Well, why don't you drive?" And I thought he was kidding. I was like, "Oh yeah, I'll just hand you the camera and you hand me the wheel and I'll drive." And he was started to stand up. He's like, "Okay, slide in." Give me that camera. I was like, all right, here we are. So yeah, going down Indian Creek, we switched places, and I drove us up to the top of Pine Mountain there. I was not ready to drive down Pine Mountain, so we pulled over, pulled it into the gas station, and changed back out. But yeah, that was kind of the most dramatic moment that I remember from the piece. But I
Uh,
also feel fortunate that all of these people welcomed me into their life and shared, a lot of stuff that doesn't make it into the film, and sometimes real tough stories, but sometimes, funny stories too. And I think that's part of it, and I hope it shows through. Is that there's definitely these folks still have a sense of humor and are figuring out they're going to find a way to survive. I hope that there are several messages that come across that are interrelated and layered. And I think that does allow people to kind of bring their own experiences to it, as you mentioned. I do think perhaps maybe the most important message, if I had to put it in a nutshell, is just simply the strength, resiliency, and creativity of working people in Appalachia. That there's people figure out how to get things done and figure out how to survive even when the system is stacked against them, and they will work at it and make it happen. So I feel like that's probably the most important, and it does seem like from those comments that people are getting a sense of that there's a sense of respect for the work. But I do think it also, I hope it opens up a conversation about how workers and community members can advocate for healthier jobs. And for example, in the case of coal truckers, the simple act of enforcing weight laws has increased their pay. And if we want to open it up to the kind of bigger and put it more in the current situation, I hope it informs these conversations about how workers from fossil fuel industries like coal hauling, can benefit from the transition to cleaner energy sources. So how do we get those folks to the table as we're designing new programs to provide America's energy? Because they're going to work at it. And if we plug them in, it's going to be a more powerful, more successful project, and we're going to have healthier communities, particularly in the Appalachian Mountains. And in fact, and a shout out to Roy Crawford in particular, because he was a big part of the lasting impact of the film. I had ended up when the film was finished, we did a national broadcast on PBS. It ended up also being part of the Headwaters series of Appalshop. And then I did some community screenings, particularly in West Virginia, where there was a debate over using the model of Kentucky's extended coal haul road system, whether they wanted to give coal trucks extra weight or not. And then I kind of moved on to the next project, moved on to working on Electricity Ferry. But Roy kept sending this film to state enforcement agencies, particularly in Kentucky. And when there was a change of governor's administration in Kentucky in the early 2000s, when Uri Fletcher came into the governor's office, he changed the Division of Commercial Vehicle Enforcement and, in fact, charged them with enforcing the coal haul weight laws. And instead of before there was a maybe gentleman's agreement to kind of let some of the overweight trucks slide, and that's part of what led to the illegal overweight loads. So they Division of Vehicle Weight Enforcement started enforcing the laws. They actually held community meetings, showed Coal Bucket Outlaw, which is how I found out about it. Showed Coal Bucket Outlaw to the truckers as explaining, this is why we're doing this. It's going to be safer. You're going to get better pay. And after they started enforcing the laws, the truckers just parked their trucks until they got a pay raise. And in the case of certain haul routes in Letcher County, I know there was one particular haul route that had actually doubled the truckers' pay. So for a short period of time in the early 2000s, the documentary, along with, of course, the enforcement action from the state, really did benefit coal truckers and doubled their pay in some cases. Now, of course, they also took action. They took the matters into their own hands by parking their trucks, doing a wildcat strike. I think that's really what turned the key. That was probably the most important element. But I do think that the film was part of that conversation and helped set the scene. And the work of advocates like Roy Crawford was also part of that conversation that set the scene. And I do think that that's an example, even though that change was short-lived. The coal business, as everybody knows, is fallen by the wayside. There's still some coal hauling jobs, but not the number that there was 20 years ago. But for a brief period of time, 20 years ago, the film was part of a change that made a difference in truckers' pay for a short period of time.
I mean, that has to be an amazing feeling. You know, that's the whole point when any of us make a documentary or a piece, really any piece of art, but I think specifically, you know, any documentary about, you know, real people and real events and issues and impacts, to see your work have a tangible impact on encouraging people to do something and really make a change. Like that's got to feel great.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's also, I mean, that's why we do it, right? I would say, and I think that's another thing that Appalshop does really well, is it kind of connects that, but it's also underscores the fact that it's not the filmmaker, me by myself doing this. It's working in collaboration, working in community. And in this case, it was out of my hands, actually. I had moved on to another project, but the folks who were involved in the film had enough of a stake that they kept working with it. And it ended up making a difference.
Do you have any plans for any more films like what you've done? I know you've done a series of things, and a lot of them are kind of in this realm, you know, between some of the ones you've done with Appalshop, Electricity Ferry, obviously Coal Bucket Outlaw, Breaks the Mountain. They're all very environmental, ecological films. But you've also got your, you know, After Coal, and some other projects that I'm assuming you're working on in the future. Do you have more plans to do more films of this style, focusing on, you know, labor and economy and ecology and all the interrelated aspects thereof?
Sort of. I think I like how you see the links between these films, because I do sort of see Coal Bucket Outlaw as the first in a trilogy that includes Coal Bucket Outlaw, Electricity Ferry, and After Coal, that are all kind of looking at the Appalachian coal fields in the early 21st century and looking at different changes, whether it's the working conditions of coal truck drivers, whether it's the fight over the coal-fired power plant in Wise County, Virginia, or whether it's how communities that were built around coal can survive once the mines close. So I sort of see those as a trilogy. I do see my work continuing around looking at how labor and the environment and Appalachian communities interact. But now that I'm living in the Blue Ridge, outside of the coal fields, I think I'm really looking more at some of the agricultural work around here, and some of the waterways and things like that. That's how my work has shifted a little bit, because that one of the other things I learned at Appalshop is there's a real benefit at working at a very local level, and then making those connections to larger regional and national forces, but that it's important to keep your work grounded in the place where you are, and so that's what I'm working on these days.
Well, that's also a really good segue in terms of the place where you are. You are now down in the Blue Ridge Mountains. You're in Boone, North Carolina, working at App State, Appalachian State University. Tell us a little bit about that work and what you're doing now, and if you have any projects you want to talk about or promote. We want to make sure that you can let people know what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, I teach in the Appalachian Studies program at Appalachian State. So we have one of two master's degree programs in the United States. And I teach the documentary field research methods and community-based arts methods, both things that I learned at Appalshop. And to our graduate program, to our graduate students. And then I teach undergraduate classes in Introduction to Appalachian Studies, and another one called Energy and well, I need to think of what it's called now. Energy and Extraction in Appalachia is what it's called. So looking at drawing on these experiences and looking at kind of keeping up to date on a lot of what's happening with energy issues. Anyway, that's kind of my teaching work. And then I continue to do creative work. I'm working on a multimedia project about the New River. I'm also have just started a documentary about the Christmas tree industry, which are the county I live in. Ashe County, North Carolina, is the #1 Christmas producing county, or at least in 2023, it was the #1 Christmas tree producing county in the United States, and relies a lot on H-2A workers, so migrant workers from Mexico that are coming up for 9 months out of the year to work on Christmas tree farms. So I'm in the vein of Coal Bucket Outlaw, looking at the relationships between the growers, who are often family farmers trying to hang on to their family farms, the migrant workers, who are often trying to hang on to family land in Mexico, and the landscape, how the landscape and the environment is impacted by it. So that's very early phase. It'll be several years before that film is out, but. And the New River project, I'm hoping to do some public events around the 50th anniversary of the New River being declared the National Scenic River, which will be 2026.
Well, thank you so much for coming out and chatting with me. I appreciate it. I'm hoping we can keep sharing your work. We'll have some other films you've made with Appalshop featured on our YouTube page and Facebook and socials as we go. And we'll be sure to follow your projects as well. We can't wait to see what comes of your New River project and the Christmas tree movie. Thank you so much, Tom.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.